The Accord fleet had been parked in stealth orbit for 9 days before anyone gave the order to announce itself. 9 days of watching. The analysts had spent most of it arguing over the contact protocol document, a 300-page guide that had been written 80 years ago by a committee that had never actually done a first contact. Rail had read it 4 times. He still was not sure it would help. The fleet carried 7 ships. The smallest one was still bigger than any structure humans had built. They hovered above the planet's northern hemisphere, invisible to every instrument Earth had, while the contact team sat in its briefing room and argued about timing. Dira had said Tuesday. Rail said it did not matter what day it was. Voss, from the command vessel, said they would do it at the first light of the planet's most populated landmass for psychological effect. Dira had looked at the floor and said nothing. So they waited for sunrise over a continent the humans called Asia. The signal was not a dramatic thing. No lights in the sky. No low rumble through the clouds. It was a transmission pushed into every frequency humans used, from radio to satellite uplink. The message had been prepared in 47 Earth languages. It was formal, measured, careful. It said, "We are here, we have been watching, we come without hostility. These are the terms of engagement. Please respond through the indicated channel." The Accord's contact AI had estimated a response window of 3 to 6 hours, possibly longer. First contact events with other species had sometimes taken days before a coherent response came. The psychological disruption alone usually caused communication delays. One species had taken 2 weeks. Another had sent only static for a month, then a very polite apology for the static. Rail sat in front of the communications console and watched the timer. Dira sat beside him with a handheld scanner she kept looking at and putting down. The room had 12 people in it and nobody was talking. 7 minutes passed. Then 8. Then at 11 minutes and 14 seconds, a voice came through the channel. It was calm, a little dry. The kind of voice that sounded like it had delivered bad news before and knew how to keep its tone flat while doing it. The voice said it had received the transmission, confirmed it had been routed to the appropriate human authority, and asked one question. It wanted to know if the fleet could switch to a visual channel, because audio only felt, and here the voice paused for exactly 1 second, a bit impersonal for a first meeting. Rail did not move. Dira looked at him, he looked at her. The AI translator confirmed the message had been understood correctly. No errors, no ambiguity. The human on the other end had heard a transmission from an alien civilization, processed it in 11 minutes, and asked for a video call. Rail said quietly, "Who is that?" Dira pulled up the intercept data. The signal had been routed through a United Nations emergency communications line. The voice belonged to a man named Oren, who held a senior diplomatic post and had spent 14 years before that coordinating disaster relief in places where infrastructure had collapsed and nobody could agree on anything. Rail read the file. He read it again. Voss's voice came over the internal channel from the command vessel. He asked what the human response had been. Rail told him. There was a pause that lasted longer than Rail expected from a man who usually had opinions faster than anyone else in the fleet. Voss said, "Did the translation system malfunction?" Dira checked it. It had not. Voss said nothing after that for almost 3 minutes. Then he said to prepare the visual link but to hold before connecting. He wanted the full command team assembled first. Rail sent the acknowledgement back to Earth. He kept it short. He said the visual channel request was being processed and that a response would follow shortly. The human Oren sent back a single line. It said, "Take your time, we are not going anywhere." Dira made a sound that was not quite a laugh. On her home planet it would not have been polite in a professional setting. She covered it quickly. The rest of the contact team had gone very quiet. Someone near the back of the room pulled up Earth's live news feeds on a secondary screen. Across the planet, humans were reacting. There was noise and confusion and politicians on screens, the way there always was. But the channel they had designated for contact was still open and still calm, and the man on the other end was waiting without any sign that 11 minutes had felt fast to him at all. Rael pulled up the contact protocol document. He found the section on unexpected early responses. There were 4 paragraphs. None of them covered this. He closed it. Oren had a thermos on his desk and a printed copy of the alien transmission in front of him that he had already marked up in 3 colors of ink. He was not the kind of person who waited to think. He thought while he was doing things, and right now he was doing 2 things at once, keeping the channel open and reading the document his assistant had just handed him, which was a very fast summary of everything Earth's governments had managed to agree on in the last 40 minutes about how to handle this. It was not very much. The visual link came through at hour 2. The screen in front of him filled with a face that was not human. The features were narrower than a human face, the eyes set wider, the skin a pale gray-green that reminded Oren of old stone. The alien wore a dark uniform with a small insignia he could not read. It looked at him with an expression that Oren could not quite name yet, somewhere between careful and confused. The alien said its name was Rael, and that it held the position of Contact Protocol Officer for the Galactic Accord. Oren wrote that down. He introduced himself, gave his title, mentioned which body he represented. Then he said he had a few questions if Rael did not mind, because the document they had sent was detailed but left some practical things unclear. Rael said the questions would be welcomed after the full protocol briefing was complete. Oren said gently that he understood, and then asked the first question anyway. It was about jurisdiction. Specifically, which of the Accord's member bodies would have authority over disputes involving Earth-registered vessels if Earth were to sign the preliminary contact agreement, and whether that authority was appellate or primary. Rael looked off-screen. Oren could see him looking at someone else. There was a brief exchange in a language the translation system had not yet fully mapped. Then Rael looked back and said that those questions were covered in the supplementary legal annex, which would be provided in a later session. Oren said that was fine and wrote something else down. The formal briefing lasted 90 minutes. It covered the Accord's history, its membership, the basic rules that governed newly contacted civilizations, and the list of things Earth was not currently permitted to do, which was long. Rael delivered it steadily and clearly. He was obviously good at this. When it was done, Oren looked at his notes. He had a page and a half of them. He asked if the Accord had a preferred venue for in-person meetings, or if the fleet carried appropriate facilities. He said his team was ready to come aboard if that was more convenient. Rael said the standard procedure involved a lengthy vetting process before any physical contact. Bioscan verification, psychological evaluation of the human delegation, construction of a neutral meeting platform in high orbit. Oren asked how long that typically took. Rael said, depending on species, somewhere between 3 weeks and 2 months. Oren nodded. He said he understood the caution. Then he mentioned, without any pressure in his voice at all, that his security advisor had already put together a hazardous environment team, and that humans had protocols for isolated first encounter scenarios going back several decades. He said they were not in a rush, but if there was a faster path they were happy to explore it. On the command vessel, Voss was watching the feed with 2 of his senior analysts. One of them said the human was moving too fast, that it was a pressure tactic. The other one said it did not feel like pressure. It felt like someone who was used to working in places where the normal timeline was not available and had learned to build a shorter one. Voss said nothing and kept watching. Dira, sitting beside Rael off-screen, sent a quiet message to his secondary panel. It said, "He has done this before, not with us but with something. Look at how he holds the pen." Rael glanced at the screen. The human, Oren, was not gripping anything. He was relaxed in his chair with the pen loose in his hand. The same way a person holds something when they are thinking, not when they are nervous. Rail said they would review the timeline and respond within a few hours. Oren said that was fine. He asked one more question before they closed the link. He said he had noticed the translation system occasionally lagged on certain phrasing. He wanted to know if Rail's team would be open to a direct language exchange session, where both sides spent a few hours going over terms together, because he found that documents translated in both directions at the same time tended to carry fewer misunderstandings into the room. Rail had never heard that suggestion before. He had done dozens of contact events. Nobody had ever asked for a bilateral translation session. He said he would consider it. After the channel closed, Rail sat in the quiet for a moment. Dira asked what he was thinking. He said he was thinking that the protocol document had a section for civilizations that were hostile, a section for civilizations that were passive, a section for civilizations that were eager but clumsy, and a section for civilizations that refused contact altogether. It did not have a section for this. Nasha had been in the shuttle for 20 minutes before anyone on the Accord ship confirmed the docking request. She spent those 20 minutes the way she spent most waiting time, reading. The document in her hand was the same Accord contact agreement Oren had been reviewing, but Nasha had gone straight to the appendices, because in her experience the appendices were where the actual structure of a thing lived. The main body was what people wanted you to see. The back pages were what they had decided before you arrived. The docking bay was large and cold and lit with a flat, even light that had no shadows anywhere. 3 Accord crew members met them at the ramp. They had the careful body language of people who had been told to be polite and were working at it. Nasha smiled at them. They did not smile back, but the one on the left shifted its weight in a way that her security instincts filed as not hostile, just uncertain. She could work with uncertain. Oren was already talking by the time they reached the meeting room. The session was supposed to be introductory. The Accord had prepared a presentation. It covered the rights of newly contacted worlds, the observation restrictions, the warp drive prohibition, and the schedule for what they called integration review, which appeared to mean the Accord deciding, over several years, how much Earth would be allowed to participate in galactic affairs. Oren listened to the whole thing without interrupting. He took notes on paper, which seemed to confuse the Accord team a little. Nasha watched Rail watch the pen moving and could see him trying to work out why a species with functioning technology would write things by hand. When the presentation ended, Oren said thank you and that he had some questions. He asked 14 of them. They were not hostile. They were not emotional. They were the kind of questions that sounded simple until you actually tried to answer them, because each one pointed at a place where the agreement's language was doing more work than it admitted. Question 7 was about the warp drive restriction. Oren asked whether the prohibition applied to independent development, to licensed development under Accord supervision, or to both, and whether there was a pathway to reclassification before the standard 50-year review period if Earth demonstrated what the document called sufficient developmental stability. Rail said that question was addressed in subsection 9 of the technical annex. Oren had already read subsection 9. He said so, politely, and then explained that subsection 9 said developmental stability would be assessed by the Accord's review committee, but did not define the criteria for that assessment or specify whether Earth had any standing to present evidence in its own favor during the review. The room got a little quiet. The lead Accord legal delegate, a woman named Sova who had written parts of the agreement herself, looked at her copy of subsection 9. Oren waited. Sova said the criteria were established by internal Accord procedure and were not typically included in contact-level documentation. Oren said he understood. He said he was not asking for the criteria to be changed. He He was asking whether Earth could be informed of them, so that if Earth were working toward reclassification, it would know what it was working toward. He said it seemed like a reasonable thing to want to know. Nobody in the room argued that it was not reasonable. By the end of the session, Oren had produced a 2-page written proposal. Nasha did not know when he had written it. She had been watching the room the whole time and still was not sure. He slid it across the table to Rael and said it was not a counteroffer, just some suggested language that he thought addressed the ambiguities they had discussed. Rael read it. He passed it to Sova. Sova read it. She passed it to the analyst beside her. The proposal did not ask for anything the Accord had refused. It did not challenge any of the core restrictions. What it did was rewrite 4 sections of the agreement using more precise language that happened to give Earth considerably more room to act within those restrictions than the original wording had allowed. Sova said carefully that she would need time to review it. Oren said, of course, take all the time they needed. Nasha caught Dira watching Oren from across the table with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of someone who had just seen a thing done well and was slightly amazed it had been done that quietly. On the walk back to the docking bay, Nasha said nothing. Oren said nothing either. They had worked together long enough that silence was comfortable between them. In the elevator, he finally said, "How do you think it went?" Nasha considered. She said, "Sova read that proposal 3 times." Oren nodded, "I know." She read it like she was looking for the problem. "There is no problem," he said. "That is the point." The shuttle undocked smoothly. Through the window, the Accord ship was enormous and very still against the dark. Nasha looked at it for a while. She had walked into a lot of rooms in her life where the other side thought they were in charge of the meeting. She had learned to recognize the exact moment when that changed. It had changed today, around question 7. Kel had not been assigned to watch the Earth feeds. He watched them anyway. His station on the contact fleet was communications mapping, which meant he spent most of his shifts cataloging the signals Earth put into the sky. There were a lot of them. Humans transmitted constantly in every direction at every hour. His people, the Sorvi, had gone quiet when the Accord fleet appeared above their planet. Instinct, probably. Hide when something larger shows up. Humans had done the opposite. The volume of Earth's transmissions had gone up in the first hour after contact, then up again. By the end of the first day, the signal output was 3 times its baseline and still climbing. He had flagged it as an anomaly in his report. His supervisor had noted it and moved on. Kel kept watching. The feeds were chaotic on the surface. Politicians spoke over each other. Crowds gathered in cities on every continent. Some people were clearly frightened. Some were angry. A lot of them were just standing outside, looking up, in the way beings do when they know something is overhead and cannot see it. But something else was also happening, and Kel noticed it because he had learned to look for the quieter signals inside the noise. The universities were running open lectures. He found 14 of them in the first 12 hours. Professors standing in front of students, going through the same questions the students had probably been asking since the announcement, talking through xenobiology, orbital mechanics, the history of Earth's own science fiction, what this might mean for religion, for economy, for law. The students were asking questions faster than the professors could answer them. A hospital in one region had posted a public message saying that their counseling lines were open, but that call volume was high, and they appreciated patience. A food distribution organization on a different continent had sent out a notice saying their services would continue without interruption, and that staff were available for any community members who needed support. A city on the coast, in a place the maps called South America, had organized a public gathering in a large open square. Kel pulled the feed. Thousands of people, sitting in the dark, watching a screen that showed the same sky they were sitting under. Some of them had brought blankets. Some had children with them. They were not panicking. They were watching. Dira came to his station in the late shift. She had stopped sleeping on schedule since the contact started. She looked at the feeds over his shoulder for a while without saying anything. Then she said, "What is that one?" She was pointing at a feed from a city far north. A woman stood in a square alone next to a hand-painted sign. The sign said, in the language of that region, something the translator rendered as, "We had questions too." Kel said he did not know who she was. The feed was from a civilian street camera. She was just a person who had gone outside with a sign. Dira was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have done 4 contact briefings. After the first one, the planet's transmission volume dropped by 60%. They went inward, stopped broadcasting. It took 3 years before they started talking normally again." Kel asked about the others. She said 2 of them had broadcast a single repeated signal, the same phrase on loop, which both times turned out to mean something close to "please, do not come closer." The 4th had shut down all non-essential communications within 6 hours, which the Accord had interpreted as a threat posture, until it turned out to be a religious observance that happened to coincide with the announcement. Kel looked at his readouts. Earth's transmission volume had not dropped. It had not plateaued. It was still rising. He was now mapping signals in frequency bands that had been mostly quiet before the contact, bands that seemed to be carrying personal messages between individuals rather than organized broadcasts. Humans were talking to each other more, not less. He pulled one of the audio feeds, a public channel out of a city in the region the maps labeled West Africa. A man was speaking in a language Kel did not have fully mapped yet. The translator gave him fragments. Something about his father, who had always said they were not alone. Something about a meal, a specific dish, that the man planned to cook that evening because it was what his family made when something large happened. Something about not knowing what came next, but that it was all right not to know yet. Kel sat with that for a while. He had a linguistics side project he worked on during slow shifts. He had been trying to map tonal variation in Earth's music for several months, because the tonal range humans used was wider than anything in the Accord's acoustic database, and he had not yet found the underlying structure. He had 400 hours of material and no clean theory to explain it. He went back to it now, not because it was his assignment, but because the man on the radio had been speaking in a way that sounded like it had music in it, and Kel wanted to understand why. Dira left his station around midnight ship time. She paused at the door and said, "Write up the transmission volume analysis properly. Don't just flag it. Voss will ask about it in the morning, and I want a real document." Kel said he would. He worked until the shift changed. The feeds kept going. Earth kept talking. Somewhere on the planet, the man from the radio was probably making dinner. Voss called the classification session at 6th hour. He did not put it on the official schedule. There were 4 people in the room: Voss, Rael, Sova, and a behavioral analyst named Pret, who had done the classification work on the last 9 contact events the Accord had handled. Pret had a reputation for being fast. He could usually place a newly contacted species into one of the 7 behavioral categories within 48 hours of first contact. He had been working on Earth for 60 hours. Voss asked him where they were. Pret put his report on the table. It was longer than his reports usually were. He said the problem was not a lack of data. He had more data on Earth than on any contact event he had worked before, because humans had been broadcasting their inner lives into open space for nearly a century, and the Accord's observation archives were full of it. The problem was that the data did not fit cleanly into any single category. Voss told him to go through it. Category 1 was civilizations that responded to contact with total submission. They treated the Accord as an authority and asked for instruction. Earth had shown none of that. Oren had walked into a meeting with an interstellar governing body and immediately started asking questions about legal standing. Category 2 was civilizations that responded with hostility. There had been no hostility, not even from the military figures Earth had included in its delegation. Nasha had sat through 3 sessions and said almost nothing, but what she had said was precise and operational, not aggressive. Category 3 was civilizations that tried to negotiate from a position of assumed equality before they understood what they were dealing with. Voss said that sounded like Earth. Pret said it would, except that Earth seemed to understand very well what it was dealing with. Oren had read the entire Accord contact framework in 40 minutes and had questions about it. That was not assumption of equality. That was someone calculating their position quickly and accurately. Rail said quietly that he had been thinking about that. He said Category 3 assumed the contacted species did not know what it did not know. Earth knew what it did not know. Oren had asked specifically about the things the agreement left undefined. He had gone looking for the gaps on purpose. Sova said she had finished reviewing the counterproposal. She said it was clean. She had spent 3 hours looking for the catch and had not found one. Everything Oren had written was technically within the Accord's existing legal structure. But the language he had used closed 4 loopholes that the Accord had relied on, without anyone ever having pointed them out, to limit new contact worlds more than the formal rules required. Voss asked her how he had found them. She said she did not know. She said she had written parts of those sections herself and had not noticed the loopholes until she read his version and saw what had changed. Pret said the behavioral categories 4 through 7 were all variations on emotional response patterns. Category 4 was civilizations that went inward. Category 5 was civilizations that fragmented, different factions trying to make separate contact with the Accord. Category 6 was civilizations that exhibited collective wonder, sort of an overwhelming awe response that tended to make them compliant. Category 7 was civilizations that went practically numb and had to be guided slowly into engagement. Earth was doing none of those things cleanly either. Different parts of the planet were fragmented in some ways, yes. There was obvious awe in some of the public response. There were humans who had gone very quiet, but none of those were the dominant pattern. Voss asked what the dominant pattern was. Pret said he had been struggling with that for 2 days. He finally said the closest thing he had was this. Earth was treating the situation the way humans treated most large problems, as something that needed to be managed while life continued. They were not stopping. Their economies were still running. Their schools had reopened the day after contact. Their emergency services had not suspended operations for a single hour. He pulled a data point from Kell's transmission analysis. In the first 3 days after contact, human individuals had made significantly more personal communications to family members than before. Not distress calls, just contact, people calling people they cared about. Voss looked at that for a moment. Rail said there was something else he wanted to raise. He said it was not strictly behavioral classification, but he thought it was relevant. He had been reviewing Earth's own records of encounters with the unknown, not space-based, historical, situations where humans had made first contact with each other, with civilizations they did not know, across their own world's history. The outcomes were not always good. Often they were very bad. But the pattern of response from the side that was contacted, not the side that arrived, was often the same: absorption. They absorbed the shock, incorporated the new information, and kept going. Sova asked if he was saying Earth had practice at this. Rail said he was saying Earth had experience at being the species that did not choose the timing of the meeting. The room was quiet for a while. Voss asked Pret for the danger assessment. Pret said Earth posed no current threat to Accord operations or member worlds. He said the long-range assessment was harder. He said a species that could read a legal framework in 40 minutes and find its structural weaknesses was a species the Accord should understand clearly before allowing deeper integration. Voss said, and there was something careful in his voice, "Understand, not fear." Pratt said yes. Voss sat back. He looked at the report. He said he wanted a new category drafted for the classification system, and that Pratt would be the one to write it. Pratt asked what to call it. Voss thought about it for a moment. He said, "Start with what they are not, go from there." Oren filed his report from the kitchen table. It was a practical choice. His office at the UN building had people coming in and out of it, and the report needed to say certain things in a certain way without being interrupted. The kitchen table had good light and no one in it except his daughter, who was 15 and doing homework and had already decided, within about an hour of the announcement, that the aliens were interesting, but that her biology exam was on Thursday, and that it would not wait for the galaxy to sort itself out. Oren respected that. He wrote the report in measured language. It covered the fleet's composition, Rael's role, the structure of the contact agreement, the key provisions and their implications. He included the counter-proposal as an attachment and noted that it was under review. He described the Accord's classification system in general terms and mentioned that Earth did not yet know where within it they had been placed. He did not include the part where Rael had looked at him, toward the end of the third session, with the expression of someone who had prepared for one kind of conversation and found themselves in a different one entirely. That was not the kind of thing that belonged in a formal report, but he thought about it. Nasha's memo came through on his secondary screen while he was still writing. It was 4 paragraphs. She had spent 2 pages on observations about the Accord team's physical positioning and behavioral tells during each session, which was the kind of thing she noticed automatically and which was, in Oren's view, more valuable than anything the formal briefings had produced. The last paragraph said, "They did not expect us to read the documents. Plan around that." He marked it for the classified annex. On the Accord ship, Rael was still in his office at hour 14. The contact assessment had a standard format. He had a template he used. He opened it and looked at it for a while, then closed it and started writing from scratch. He wrote about the 11-minute response time. He wrote about Oren's request for a bilateral translation session, which no contacted species had ever asked for, and which upon reflection he thought was one of the more intelligent things anyone had done in an opening contact exchange. He wrote about the counter-proposal and what it meant that a species in its first formal meeting with the Accord had identified 4 structural ambiguities in the contact framework and addressed them using the Accord's own legal language. He wrote about Nasha, who had said almost nothing across 3 sessions and whose silence had felt, he realized now, exactly like the silence of someone who was watching and cataloging and would have things to say later in a different room. He wrote about Dira's observation from the second session that Oren held a pen the way a person does when they are thinking, not when they are afraid. He wrote about Kell's transmission analysis, that Earth's communications volume had gone up, not down, that humans had called their families more in the 3 days after contact than in the 3 days before, that somewhere on the planet people had held a public gathering in a square and just sat together under the sky. The standard closing section of a contact assessment asked for a stability rating and a recommendation: stable, marginal, or unstable. Rael had written unstable twice in his career. He had written marginal more than he could count. He wrote stable. Then he sat with it for a moment because stable felt like the right word but not the complete one. He added a note beneath it. He wrote that the assessment category used by the Accord for newly contacted civilizations did not fully describe Earth's situation, and that Pratt's classification review should be prioritized before any further integration planning. He wrote that the Accord should not mistake Earth's composure for passivity. He wrote that there was a difference between a species that was not afraid of you and a species that had decided you were not worth being afraid of, and that Earth did not appear to be either of those things. What Earth appeared to be, he wrote, was a species that had looked at a situation larger than anything it had encountered before, and treated it as a problem that could be worked on. He sat back and looked at the last line for a while. Then he wrote one more sentence. It was not the kind of sentence he usually put in official documents, but he left it in. He wrote, "They were not waiting to be found. They were waiting for the conversation to start." In the communications bay, Kell had been there since hour 7 and showed no sign of leaving. He had mapped 14 new tonal structures in Earth's music and had a theory he wanted to test, which required pulling another 800 hours of material from the Accord's observation archives. He had filed the request already. Dira stood at the observation deck window and watched the planet below. The cloud cover over the western ocean was breaking. City lights showed through in patches, scattered and steady, the way they had been the first night she had seen them through the observation telescope when she had joined the surveillance rotation 11 years ago. She had asked to be on the contact fleet specifically because of Earth. Her supervisor had approved it without asking why. She had never told anyone why. The reason was simple. She had watched the feeds for years. She had watched humans argue and recover and fail and try again and sometimes make a genuine mess of things and then try to fix the mess, not always well, but persistently. She had watched a species that was not at peace with itself or its history or, from what she could tell, with the future it was headed toward. And she had thought, "I want to be in the room when they find out we are here." She had wanted to see what they would do. Now she knew. She stayed at the window until the lights of the planet's next city appeared below the cloud line, bright and steady and going about their business.